Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Please mute yourselves and remain so. And if you have questions, enter them in the chat and identify the individual that you are asking the question of. My name is Christina Schlitt, and I'm the current president of the League of Women Voters of Michigan. The League's mission to empower voters and defend democracy has been the goal for more than 100 years. Today, we want to inform you of the work the League of Women Voters Advocacy Committee and Board have been doing since the 39 anti-voter bills were introduced by the Michigan Legislature on March 24th, 2021, just before they went on break. The speakers we have with us today will provide updates, insights, and a broad perspective of the action the League, along with our partner organizations, has taken to combat the movement of these voter suppression legislation. I'd like to introduce Judy Karanjeff. She is our current chair of the State Advocacy Committee, past vice president of advocacy, and past president of the League of Women Voters of Michigan. Judy has been preparing a complete list of the bills and their current status, and that is available on the website. Judy?
I just wanted to let you all know that the Advocacy Committee, as well as Voter Suppression Committee with Paula Bowman and Christina and Betsy Cushman and Sue Smith and I, have been tracking these bills since they were introduced on March 24th, and we provided testimony at most of the committee meetings in the Senate, not in the House. We've done 2 action alerts. So we keep an updated list on the first page of the web page, thanks to Paula Bowman, and you can see that list anytime. And we'll keep you informed as we go along. I'll let Sharon take it away with more information after you introduce her, Christina.
Thank you, Judy. Now I'd like to introduce Sharon Dolente, who is a senior advisor at Promote the Vote, where she continues her work advocating for policies that increase participation in our democracy. Sharon was one of the architects of Proposal 3 of 2018 and led the team that drafted the Constitution language. While working at ACLU of Michigan, and now Sharon lives with her family in Southwest Michigan. She will highlight legislation for us and try and make sense of what is happening now. Sharon?
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks, Christina. That's a very tall order to try and make sense of everything. I don't know whether I can do that because that may not actually be possible, but let's try and have a conversation about what's been going on. I will try and provide some background and some details. And I know Christina and those who put together the event today have time for questions and answers. So please do. I want to strongly encourage you, as Christina said, to use your chat box to ask those questions as they come up, because we have a lot to talk about. So I thought I would start with, let me just tag to my notes. Oh, I have to turn that off. Sorry about that, folks. All right, so let's talk about like what's been going on in the Michigan legislature, because it's been really quite busy for quite a long time now. Let me just toggle over to my notes here. Okay, so hold on one second. I seem to have lost my notes. Well, let me just start this way. So let me just introduce Promote the Vote. As many of you, I think, on this call know, was really an effort and a collaborative effort that began back in 2018 around the pro-democracy ballot initiatives that ended up being on the ballot in 2018. So Promote the Vote is and always has been a collaboration of organizations, with tremendous participation of organizations like the League of Women Voters, because these issues around democracy have become so intense And they, there's just a need, as we're going to talk today through this, there's just a need for really close collaboration as we move through this challenging time. So, all right, let's go back to earlier this year, a time in which there was a time before the Senate dropped its 39 bill package, where quite honestly, the House, the Michigan House of Representatives, was dabbling in voting in elections. And I think Judy would agree with me, since she watches very closely, that the House's approach was really, at least at the beginning, much more collaborative. They put some bills up, they were really getting a lot of input, it was moving very slowly. And I think, slow moving legislation is a good thing around voting in elections. So we make sure that we're getting it right. So that's going on over in the Michigan House. And meanwhile, as you all know, right, then the Senate introduces this 39 bill package to essentially suppress the vote. You may have heard early on that that I think when they introduced it in the beginning, they tried to say that it had some good things in it, but as you notice, nobody's been talking about those good things for months. And those good things aren't moving. And those good things, even if you could call them like one or two good things, were so poorly written, and honestly, really not thought out. I'll give you an example. They had a bill regarding election day registration, but it was one day. Not election day registration, early voting. It was one day of early voting. You would certainly not want to go through the trouble to ask all of your 1,500 clerks to create an entire new system and sort of way for voters and clerks to interact for a single day. If you're going to go through that process, you want to make sure that that process is robust. And how do I know that one day is not robust? Because there's not a single state in the country that has one day of early voting. In fact, the average is 19 days, more than 2 weeks. So again, we saw when this bill comes out, we see, some very minimal things you might be able to, arguably put more in the positive column, but they're very poorly written. They're not well thought out. They're not, really looking again at all the ways. If you change one thing, you do need to, make sure that you're changing it in all the other areas of our election code. But as you know, nearly all of this 39 bill package is a voter suppression package. So let me just kind of give some general areas that it suppresses. So it makes it harder to vote. That is, the first thing. So we're seeing in the last week, strict photo ID. You're seeing limitations on drop boxes. You're seeing banning of prepaid postage, which voters really like. So you have just, straight voter suppression efforts. Then beyond that, you move to really dangerously increasing the power of partisan challengers. So this is how I've come to understand it, to really distill what the danger is. I am sure all of you all as active league members, right? You've been in a polling location, you perhaps observed, you perhaps handed out literature, you're active in civic, you understand the sort of flow in a polling location, right? The voters should be the most important thing in a polling location, right? And then the individuals that are there to serve them should be the second most important. And really what these bills do is they elevate the authority of partisan challengers in the polling location, which is the absolute opposite of what we need. We don't need an individual who is motivated by, or a set of individuals motivated primarily by partisan interests in our polling locations, slowing the process down, making the process more chaotic. These bills would also eliminate nonpartisan challengers, like the League of Women Voters, like the ACLU, like the Lawyers Committee, like the NAACP. So again, it's shifting more into the control and sort of lane and sort of the battlefield of partisans, even in our polling locations, which is the exact opposite of what we need in Michigan. So the next issue, sort of bulk of bills, is it really undermines election administration. So, again, going back to the polling location, as you probably know, right, it takes a lot of work and orchestration and funds and mechanics to get the whole system of voting and elections to work. And this past year, because of the strains on the election administration system, this past year, meaning in the 2020 election, and the pandemic, election officials were really struggling to, for example, pay for what they needed in order to serve voters. So private charitable resources, grants, charitable foundation grants were provided to local election administrators to help them do what they would need to do to make sure we had a free and fair election in this very, very chaotic time. There were also additional federal funds. The federal government is a huge source of funding for election administration. And so this 39 bill package threatens private funds. It threatens federal funds. It requires, it mandates, which is kind of like we already have this, but so right now we already have a system in which you have to have bipartisan election inspectors in your polling location to the best that local clerks can do. Because the reality is that there are parts of the state that have really mostly people of one who are participating as poll workers, folks of one political party or another. So this would, create penalties if clerks can't do what they are already trying to do and are legally obligated to do. So again, it's these, interjecting more partisan control, more partisan influence, and what I really describe as sort of gumming up or creating chaos in the process, which is the last thing we need. I think what we saw in 2020 was a little more, it was a great election, run smoothly given all the circumstances, but there were some parts that we could have done without, like people protesting absentee counting boards and things like that. So I'd like to have a little less of that sort of stuff. Okay, speaking of chaos, these bills would create a lot of chaos in what I describe as the election certification process. So we focus, a lot of us, both as voters, but also as advocates in the voting space, on the work of making sure people can make their voice heard. Obviously critical, if not the most critical, but it's not the whole process of voting elections. Another really important part of that is the tallying of the votes, of course, and then how those votes get tallied at the precinct level, and then they get tallied at the jurisdiction level, and then they get tallied at the county level. And so, right, there's this process of doing math and counting up all of these votes. This 39 bill package just has a variety of things that really, they're not making the system any more secure, and they are attempting to just kind of disrupt the process, is how I would describe it. So for example, there's a proposed bill that's moving saying clerks have to deliver the results the day after the election at 12 noon. Well, I think many of you may remember that certain communities weren't done counting the votes at noon the next day. So how could you create a law that says you must deliver the results at 12 noon the next day, right after you've had an election in which you knew the votes were not completely counted by 12 noon the next day? And the legislature is continuing to refuse to give clerks more time to pre-process absentee ballots. So part of the reason why it took some time, longer than we all would have liked, for the ballots and results to be released after Election Day is that Michigan has not adopted and sort of modified its practices now that so many people are voting absentee, and providing more time to start that processing before Election Day. So this was an issue that the legislature refused to take up really with any. They gave a little crumb of 10 hours, but it wasn't enough, and that's why we saw the counting continue afterwards. Another really dangerous provision in this 39 bill package is that at each county level, there is a board of county canvassers. I know Christina participated watching her county board of canvassers, as many of you all did. And that county board of canvassers, as you may remember, again, it's part of that process of counting in each step. And, we do the math and then we get the total votes across the state of Michigan. It's very methodical. Every county has a board of canvassers, and it's equally divided with 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. They have a bill in the legislature that would increase the size, but also most dangerously require some counties to have a super majority vote in order to certify its results. So without like explaining it more, if you impose a super majority to report the results out of some counties, those counties are going to have more trouble reporting their results. It's harder to get a super majority than it is to get a majority. And guess what? The places that would have this supermajority requirement are largely Democratic districts, but even more dangerously, it is the highest population counties in the state. So the most voters in our state of Michigan would now be under this supermajority requirement, which would put the tallying of their votes at risk. And it's also the areas where the largest populations of communities of color, so African Americans, Asian Americans, Arab Americans, Native Americans, et cetera, are living. So again, that's not just, that's not just by chance. I think it is a direct effort to undermine certain voters and literally to try and design a system in which the votes of certain voters will not count. Finally, the last category I'll just mention briefly is that there was some efforts in the bill to undermine direct democracy in our process for like an initiative and stuff like that. So it would cut the time in which you could signature gather and impose some other requirements. So let me turn really quickly now and talk about where we are. So let me just say at the end, the Senate has moved these bills. We thought the Senate would move these bills really quickly, because we thought that they wanted to have a veto by the governor, and that then they would use their second sort of strategy to go around the governor, which is called an initiated law. So just a really quick on what an initiated law is. You can gather a couple 100,000 signatures and you can put a bill to the legislature, and then the legislature has 40 days to sign it. And if the legislature chooses to sign it, it does not require the governor in order to go into law. So it is, some describe it as an end run around a governor, and particularly a governor who's going to veto something. It is in our Constitution. It is a mechanism that exists, and it really is only used in order to get around the governor. And it wasn't the intent when it was created in our Constitution a really long time ago. And so, as many of you know, Proposal 3 was resoundingly supported. Our most recent reform of voting rights was resoundingly supported by the voters of Michigan, right? It went to a full vote of the people. More than 2/3 of the voters of the state of Michigan supported it. And now our next set of reforms is at risk of having a couple 100,000 people send it to the legislature, which is gerrymandered and controlled by one party for a very long time, who has not done much for voting rights, which is why we had Prop 3, with the chance that they would be able to enact this without the governors, without the governor having a say and without the people having a say. And there has been, as you've probably seen, right, a lot of statements from Chair of Ron Weiser of the Michigan Republican Party saying that that was the path that they were going to take, that they were going to essentially enact some version of these voter suppression bills come hell or high water, no matter what the governor does. So that's really disheartening. And I think many of us have been sort of living under that somewhat that disheartening reality. But let me say, where are we today? So they still have not submitted any petition language. You get notice when they submit petition language to the state. So they have not begun any process to gather signatures to pass these voter suppression measures through an end run. But they have sped up in the last couple of weeks. I think Judy would agree with me. Really, the only things that they've moved with any real intentionality and sort of desperate speed has been their voter ID bills. And I'll take a minute to explain where we are on that. Michigan has had a voter ID law. Please tell all your friends. Michigan has had a voter ID law for decades. And we have a law that requires, as you know, asks someone and requires everyone to be asked to show an ID. And if you don't have the ID, you can sign a legal document swearing under penalty of perjury that you are who you say you are. And that's the system we've had for decades. And nothing in the GOP report, the Republicans report released last week, which I'll talk about in a minute, nor any other report has said that there was some breakdown in Michigan's decades-old voter identification law. But nonetheless, this has become something that is a driving force behind the efforts to pass anti-voter bills. And most recently last week, the House, you remember I told you a few minutes ago, the House started with this slow and deliberative and thoughtful process, and we were feeling very positive about the House. But last week, the House decided to turn up the heat and make the voter identification bill that they're trying to push through the legislature the worst in the country. And that is what they passed out of the House last week. They passed a set of voter restrictions and identification requirements that no state in the country has imposed. So, if your friends tell you everybody has an ID, this is just the way, it is, I want you to push back on them and say that's not true at all, because the current proposal, no state in the country has adopted. And it would frankly impose a burden on every voter to have photo ID, and then it would impose additional a burden on every voter in order to make sure their signature matches the signature on file. So you would have not one, but two chances of being deprived of your ballot arbitrarily by the poll worker in your precinct. And if you did, you'd get a provisional ballot, and then you'd have to go later to the clerk's office to show a variety of forms of identification in order to, hope and pray that your ballot was going to count. So I guess to sum it up, the legislative process has moved more slowly, I think, than any of us expected. I think that has in part because of the good work of the League of Women Voters and Promote the Vote and all of our partners. We have been very aggressively communicating with citizens who've been then communicating with legislators. So great work. We've also all been doing a really great job educating the media and reporters on these issues, and they've been doing an extraordinary job of reporting them accurately. I think that reporters learned a lot, unfortunately, through our experience in 2020, and they are really careful with the facts now about all these voter suppression bills. And where we are now is, I think that it appears that the legislature is intent on pushing a voter ID bill in front of the governor. The governor has been clear that she's not going to suppress voters in the state of Michigan. So I expect that she'll veto that. And I think that's absolutely the right decision for her. Michigan doesn't need to have the most voter suppression voter ID bill in the country. We don't need that, and we don't want that. And so then I think we will see whether or not the rumors or the statements to the press, whether or not there is an anti-voter initiative that comes before the voters to sign. It won't come before all the voters. Some voters will be given an opportunity to sign a petition, and then it would, as I said, go to the legislature, and it could potentially go an end run around the governor and the voters, unfortunately. So Christina, why don't I stop there? I'm not exactly sure where I am in the time, but let me pause and you tell me if I should go more or less.
You have a few minutes left, but let's ask a couple of these questions directly to what you said. Were the 39 bills from the model legislation developed by Heritage Action and ALEC?
I have not compared them exactly, but my understanding, it sounds like whoever asked that question had seen the article that Heritage Action and ALEC, of course, produces a lot of bill, is the sort of percolation where a lot of bills come. So I believe, my understanding is that a lot of these did come out of Heritage Action because you're seeing similar bills in similar states, right? We are not the only ones facing, and there's a lot of rinse and repeat going on in a number of key states.
Thank you. And would you explain the supermajority issue again? Does that mean votes can be counted if they don't have a super, or votes won't be counted if they don't have a supermajority?
Yeah, so every county has a county board of canvassers. Right now it's equally divided, and all that board does really is I describe it now as doing the math, right? They do the math from all the communities in the county, and they add up, and they do, attempt, if there's any questions, they attempt to resolve those questions, which is, very difficult in highly populated counties when you have so many precincts. So there's just not as much time. But they attempt to resolve any, outstanding clerical questions, and they tally things up. And then they, let's say they say 10 votes for this person, and 11 votes for this person. And then in order for those votes to be essentially, the way I described it is like reported up to the state, the county board of canvassers has to have a majority vote. It's like any, they have to, anything in your League of Women Voters board meetings, it has to be, voted out and by a majority. And so under the current system, that would be, it would require bipartisan support, right? Because it's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, but you only need one of you don't need 4, you don't need both of both parties, if that makes sense. So you could get by with 3. So, and that's what happened, for example, in Wayne County in 2020. The only reason Wayne County, at least eventually got its votes reported up to the state was it was 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. And so the supermajority would require like a supermajority. So if it increases the size of the county board, let's say to 3 and 3, and now you need 3 votes of one party and 2 votes of another party. And, given what we saw last year, people are not taking principled positions on why they are not voting to report their results, or certify is the technical term. They are partisan actors, and they are acting in the interest of a partisan outcome or a candidate outcome, which is not in service of the voters. So that is the danger. The danger is that they would deadlock and we would have more chaos. And I'm really sorry. What would happen is that they would immediately go to court, and the court would tell them to count the votes. So it'd be a waste of time and money.
Okay, thank you. We do have several more questions, but we've allowed time at the end also. And but one thing before we introduce our next speaker, if you could touch on the report that came out last week from the legislature. It sounded really positive that, there was no identifiable fraud. The election was good, but yet we have these 39 bills.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, Christina, to ask me to explain them. But I guess what I would say is, yes, the facts that you described are true. And in fact, I've even seen some news articles this week sort of saying this is so inconsistent, right? For you to release a report that found what we all know to be true, which that the 2020 election was safe and secure and accurate. That was confirmed by an audit, not just one audit, but 250 audits, some of which came into being as a result of Prop 3. And then to say, but we need this security measure that is going to disenfranchise some voters, right? And that is what a strict photo ID and this kind of ID approach does. If you want to find ways to make it easier for citizens to make their voice heard, streamline the process, provide more access, I think the League of Women Voters and Promote the Vote would be all about that. But to have a report say the election was secure and the results can be trusted, and then say in the same week that you need to pass things that are going to disenfranchise people. And they're going to disenfranchise people in ways that have a racially disparate impact. And they're also going to disenfranchise voters with disabilities who are going to have potentially more trouble making a signature match happen because their medical condition might make their signature change over time. Why would you be intentionally disenfranchising registered voters in Michigan and pursuing those policies at the same time you concluded the election was safe and secure? Unfortunately, I cannot answer that question.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Don't run away. We've got more questions at the end. And right now, I would like to introduce Virginia Kase-Solomon, the League of Women Voters U.S. Chief Executive Officer. Ms. Solomon has spent the last 25 years of her career fighting for social justice and civil rights. As CEO of the League of Women Voters, Virginia builds upon her vision of the inclusive democracy where every person in America has the ability and the opportunity to participate and advocate for issues that matter to them. Virginia has been the CEO for a few years and brings an energetic and driving force to the League's growth and national programs. And Virginia will bring us a perspective of the voter suppression activities that have been happening nationally. Virginia?
Hi, Christina. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see all of you. I am going to ask for a little indulgence here. I have to use a ring light because this office that I'm in is dim, and sometimes I get a reflection, but I need glasses now because I will be 50 in the fall, and I've learned the joys of not being able to see without them. So I apologize if there's a little annoying reflection going on there, but I can't do anything about it, unfortunately. And Sharon, thank you for your helpful presentation about the state of legislation in Michigan. It seems like this problem just really is going on in every state around the country. And unfortunately, Michigan just gets it really bad time and time again. And so I am thankful to be able to be here with all of you and to thank you for all the work that you all are doing on the front lines in your state. This past weekend, we had our National Council meeting of state league leaders from around the country. So while I know the threats are real, I'm also really inspired and motivated whenever I get to spend time with league leaders and hear about all of the work that you are doing to help advance voting rights and our democracy. So there's a lot that's happening in Washington right now, but you guys, you're the ones on the front lines. And so for us at the national office, it's really essential that we are aligned in our strategies for the sake of democracy. We don't want to do or support anything that would undermine what you're trying to do in the states and vice versa, right? We want to make sure that everything we do is complementary. I'm going to talk about 6 things today. Hopefully, if I can get as much of it in 15 minutes as possible. So I will try to keep it very high level. I want to talk a little bit about the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, redistricting, the midterms, DC statehood, and what we like to call SCOTUS Watch. There are some important cases, one in particular that we're waiting for a decision on that the league has partnered on and filed amicus on in Arizona. But starting with the For the People Act. So I'm sure many of you have heard about this, you are familiar. The For the People Act, for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar, is a comprehensive democracy form legislation. It is probably one of the greatest opportunities that we have to transform not only our elections, but the way that our democracy functions and to modernize. I think that's one of the things, we have a lot of old provisions and I would go back to the 2020 election because with COVID, we saw state after state trying to make it easier for people to vote. And while there were we had 72 lawsuits around the country, different leagues. And so to ensure that people would have access to the ballot. But I will say that, as the league always does, we fought for it and through litigation, but the advocacy piece is important to mention as well. And so what we saw was an expansion of mail-in voting, of same-day registration, a variety of different things to make it easier for people to vote. And so this really is, the For the People Act is a great way for us to build upon those successes, although obviously state by state, there are a lot of different things happening to try and prevent people from being able to vote. But this would kind of like, for lack of a better term, trump all of those bad pieces of legislation. Unfortunately, last week, the US Senate, Republicans in the US Senate blocked a vote to bring the For the People Act to, for a vote. That was because of the filibuster. I'm not going to get too in depth on the filibuster today because there are a lot of different opinions about how the filibuster should be used. I will say for the record, though, that the league has taken a position on the filibuster. We support a talking filibuster currently, meaning that we don't believe in secret holds. We think that if people are going to oppose a piece of legislation from debate or from being voted upon, that should be done publicly so we know exactly who is opposing and why. We think that is part of transparency and good government, and that's something that we continue to support. But this sweeping pro-democracy bill, the For the People Act, will make our elections fairer, put power back in the hands of the American voters up for debate. We did at the League help shape this piece of legislation, started back in 2018. So, this is not something new. It was introduced back in 2018. We didn't see much opportunity for it to go anywhere at that time. And so we do have a shot now. I will say that even though it wasn't brought to a vote last week, it doesn't mean that it's gone, right? This will be revisited this summer. And so it's really important that as people are having conversations with their legislators, as they are thinking about how we educate people on this, it's really important that people are getting as much information out to voters to continue to put the pressure on legislators to move the For the People Act forward. Another thing that the League was really very much part of when it came to shaping the For the People Act was same-day voter registration. We really stood our ground in making sure that was included in this legislation. We also supported independent citizen redistricting commissions, which is something the League has done for a long time, and that I can talk a little bit more about that as I talk about registration. But one thing I will say, and I can't repeat this enough, this really is the only solution that we have in place to put a check on the hundreds of anti-voter bills passed in states around the country. And it's also a piece of legislation that the majority of Americans support. Americans support pro-voter protections. It is wildly popular among Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And so while there are people in parties and politicians who will politicize this for their own gain to entrench themselves in power, and there's a lot of conversation back and forth, let's not forget that this is a piece of pro-voter legislation. And so there is a lot of great momentum and pressure to try and get this again later on this summer, all throughout the country. And so it's not just groups like here at the League, but there are groups and activist organizations all throughout the country, in communities, small towns, statewide, who really see this as a solution. And so we are going to continue to advocate for that. And I will say that we know both senators in Michigan have demonstrated strong support for this bill. And so we also need to thank them for that. I think it's really important when our legislators support this work to make sure that we are saying thanks when we should. There are lots of provisions in here that I think are important. And again, there's not time to go in detail. The Brennan Center has a great, so for those of you who are familiar with the Brennan Center or those who are not, if you go to brennancenter.org, and I can drop this in the chat for Christina to share with all of you, there is a really great annotated version of what each provision of this legislation would do. But it does everything from modernizing voter registration, restoring the Voting Rights Act. It touches on election security, campaign transparency, empowering small donors, enforcing campaign finance laws and strengthening campaign contribution limits, Supreme Court ethics reforms, expanding lobbying disclosures, executive branch ethics reforms, disclosure of the presidential tax return. So there's a lot in here. And I think it's really important that everyone become as aware as possible. Again, we know this is an uphill battle, but this is something that we absolutely support. The next thing that I will talk about real quickly here is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is another piece of legislation that we're monitoring this Congress. It is a way for us to be able to it's complementary. I think I just need to step back for a second. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is complementary to the For the People Act. So you might hear people saying, well, why do we need the For the People Act if we have the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act? I think it's important to note that these are complementary pieces of legislation. So we can't say, oh, we're just going to have one and not the other. It doesn't really work that way. One of the things that I've heard people say about this is that the For the People Act can be seen as the sword, which is basically reclaiming the power to people, to voters. And the VRAA can be thought of as a shield. It's our defense against racist and discriminatory voting laws. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, it requires a legislative record of field hearings on voter discrimination to protect it from potential legal challenges in the future. So it is actually moving a little bit slower. So it hasn't really, excuse me, been introduced in 2021 because there's a lot to incorporate in that record. But again, the For the People Act is ready to go, and it is on an aggressive timeline. It did pass the House in March. We know last week that it wasn't able to move forward, but these are two very important complementary pieces of legislation that we want to make sure that everybody is aware of. I think, you know, as you all know, the pre-clearance, I'm sure, I know I'm talking to a lot of like voting junkies, and so we all kind of live and breathe this. But what this bill, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will do is restore the strength, our freedom to vote by making sure that any changes to voting rules that can discriminate against voters based on race or background are federally reviewed so that we all have an equal say in our future. And by restoring the Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court gutted in 2013, it really safeguards Black voting rights and restoring voting power to communities of color. So those, again, you know, I just can't emphasize enough, they're not separate. They do need to be together. They are complementary, and while they will be introduced at different times, they are both really important pieces of legislation. And then redistricting, and I'm really trying to rush through, Christina, I'm sorry, so let me know, like, jump in, please, if I'm going too long.
No, don't rush.
But redistricting, we are on the verge of kicking off redistricting in a matter of weeks, this map drawing process when the census data becomes available in September. And the process is condensed this year because the pandemic delayed the census, which means that states will have less time to draw and implement new maps. So it's really critical and important that this is, you know, done as best as it possibly can be. There's no such thing as right. I feel like I've learned that through redistricting, but as we best can. This is also the first redistricting cycle without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. So this is more important than ever that we are able to get this right. With Michigan losing one representative as a result of the census, it's also really critical that your redistricting commission draw district maps that accurately represent the people they're meant to serve. And I know this is something that is of critical importance to all of you and something the League has worked on for a very long time. I see my friend Sue Smith, I think I saw you earlier. Hi, Sue. But you guys have been engaged in this for a very long time. And I know that earlier this month, you all, LWVMIchigan, filed an amicus brief with the Michigan Supreme Court in support of Michigan Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission's proposed extended timeline for adopting your final redistricting plan. And so the League does support the Commission's proposal of adopting final plans for new congressional and legislative districts by January 25th, instead of the current November 1st deadline. And so I know you guys, you know this, and have been working on it. And so while we're waiting for census data to be finalized in census states, we want as many people to get involved now. And so we do have a national program. It is called the People Powered Fair Maps program, and it's working to empower people to get involved and ensure that voices in communities are heard. This is a national league program, meaning that almost every state throughout the country is part of People Powered Fair Maps. I have worked personally really hard to raise money to get investments into states across the country, into leagues. And we are going to continue to work to help raise money to support your efforts, because we know that this is just so very critical. Some of the things that I know that you are doing, we hope that you will continue to do, is to hold public forums, town hall meetings, public hearings about fair redistricting. It's happening now. And so we really want to be able to partner with all of you on that. And I know this is something that is critical, of critical importance to you. The next thing I will move on to is the midterm elections. As you know, in just a few months, we will be into the 2020 midterms. And, while we hope that we will not see some of the shameful behavior we saw, and I think that's the only word I can use to describe it, that is professional. I would say shameful behavior we saw in the 2020 elections. We are hopeful, but we also know that there are people who oppose everything that we stand for. And so for much of our work and so much of the voter access that we fought for last year is in danger because of many of the suppressive voter laws that are happening state by state. And so I do go back to the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act as just being critical pieces of legislation that we want to move forward to help mitigate some of that. And as Sharon spoke about the dangerous bills, across the country, I think she would obviously also agree that the For the People Act is one of those ways that we can do that. I will say that for the League, we saw incredible impact in 2020 in our work. We had the largest voter turnout in our nation's history. The League did a comprehensive Get Out the Vote program. We were very proud this year that we were able to help educate more than 25 million voters through Vote 411, which is something that all of you participate in. And we want to build on that momentum to make sure that voters have the information that they need and that their voices are heard. And so while we're trying to fight these pieces of legislation, we're also trying to focus on making sure that people have the information they need to cast their ballots. And so one of the things that we want to do is continue in 2022. And again, primaries are starting in less than a year. Here we are. It's like one election is over and the next begins. We really want to coordinate our network of state and local leagues and work with partners to mobilize across the country and collaborate with partner organizations to make sure that they were getting this information out. We are really also focusing on repairing a lot of the damage that has been done and combating mis and disinformation. The League has a program that we have been working on for several years. It's called the Campaign for Making Democracy Work. And so we will be partnering with all of you on that. DC statehood. I know this probably sounds weird, but I always have to make my pitch for DC statehood because that is something that is also really critical to the people who live here. And also because we know that so many people here in Washington, DC, more than 700,000 people are disenfranchised. They do not have representation in Congress. The majority of the people who live here are people of color and have no senators. No Senate and congressional representation. And it's really sad because we have more people here who reside in the district than 2 states. So when you think about, the people of DC paying taxes, serving in our military, impacted by national decisions and not having representation, it's something that we are focusing on at the League National Office and that we have asked state leaders to help us support this effort by notifying their legislators. And then the last thing is what we call our SCOTUS watch. We have a really important case that we're still waiting on a decision for, and it's Branovich versus the DNC. And that's a challenge to the Voting Rights Act related to 2 voting laws in Arizona. One law that is banning ballot collection, and a law tossing out votes if a voter goes to the wrong precinct to cast their ballot. And so depending on how the court rules, this could have real impact on our work. And so what I would say is just also that is something to keep your eyes out for. And I know that, it's something that any Supreme Court decision will impact all of our work. But those are some of the big things. And I apologize that I'm rushing through. There's always just so much to talk about, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody may have specifically. I think you're muted, Christina.
Thank you, Virginia. You referred to redistricting, and that's a big project here in Michigan. So I'd like to introduce Sue Smith just to give us a little update, and then we'll go back to you and to Sharon for questions. I'd like to introduce Sue, the current League of Women Voters Vice President of Advocacy, the past president and current project leader for the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission project. She's been a champion of the redistricting movement since the last time the maps were drawn. Sue?
Thanks, Christina, and hi, everybody, and welcome, Virginia. Yes, we've been talking about the voter bills that have been introduced into the Michigan Legislature as well as across the country. And sometimes people ask, well, what does that have to do with redistricting? Well, we know that how redistricting maps are drawn affects the legislation passed by the legislature as well as the U.S. Congress. One of the important things to think about is, what about our current maps, those that were adopted by the Michigan Legislature back in 2011? In 2017, the League of Women Voters of Michigan filed a lawsuit in the Eastern District Federal Court claiming that 34 of Michigan's congressional and legislative district maps were unconstitutional because of partisan gerrymandering. A panel of 3 federal judges agreed and ordered the state legislature to draw new maps in time for the 2020 election. The case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled that partisan gerrymandering is not a federal issue and should be addressed in the state courts. However, the unconstitutionality of the current maps is still relevant because the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission is considering whether to start with the gerrymandered maps as a basis for the new maps. The 13-member Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission, what a mouthful that is, or the MICRC as it is commonly known, consists of 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 5 independents. It was selected by a random process as outlined in the Constitution and has been meeting since last September. The League has been observing, reporting on, and occasionally testifying at those commission meetings. The MICRC has the sole responsibility for drawing 3 sets of district maps for the U.S. Congress, the Michigan House, and the Michigan Senate. Before the commission can begin drawing those maps, the Constitution requires them to hold a minimum of 10 public hearings across the state. The commission chose to hold 16, 1 in each of the 14 congressional districts, plus 2 more. This Thursday, the MICRC will be completing its first round of required public hearings in Grand Rapids. During each of these hearings, League volunteers have served as greeters and helped the public sign in at the public comment table. The Constitution also requires the commission to follow 7 prioritized criteria when it creates the 3 sets of maps. The first 2 criteria require districts to be of equal population, in compliance with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and other federal laws, and to be geographically contiguous. Immediately following is the third criterion, which states districts shall reflect the diverse population of the state and communities of interest. Communities of interest may include, but are not limited to, populations that share cultural or historical characteristics or economic interests. Communities of interest, or COIs as they are known, is a new concept in Michigan. Leagues have held town halls in communities across the state to educate the public on COIs and how they can participate in the MICRC public hearings. In addition, over 25 local league teams have identified and trained communities of interest in their communities in how to write and give testimony, as well as how to use mapping software and the Commission's public comment portal. Currently, as of today, in fact, the MICRC is discussing the map drawing process, excuse me, including how to interact with Election Data Services, the company they hired to help them draw the maps. An important part of the conversation is whether to start with the current gerrymandered maps or start from scratch. The League and a number of other organizations and individuals have urged the MICRC to start from scratch, not with the current maps. The Constitution requires that the maps be drawn at an open meeting, which must be available for the public to watch live. They will start drawing the maps in July, and if you would like to watch or have an opportunity to see what they're doing, go to michigan.gov/MICRC, and you'll find a schedule of the meetings and a link so that you can sign up to watch. Thank you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions if there's time at the end.
Thank you, Sue. We do have some questions. This one is to Virginia. Virginia, you mentioned that the For the People Act will be revisited at the end of the summer. Can you explain what that will look like?
So it's really hard to say. Now the Republicans and the Democrats and members of the Senate will start to go do the back and forth, so to speak. So it's really hard to say if it will be a piece of legislation, a compromise legislation like the one that Joe Manchin put forward, if it will be something else. I think, you're going to hear a lot of conversation around the filibuster coming up soon. So I wish I had like a crystal ball to gaze into and say, this is what it's going to look like. Unfortunately, we really don't know just yet what that would look like. And I will say that for the League, we have historically not supported voter ID. And so this is also something that was in the Manchin piece of legislation. Our board at the national office had not had a chance to even discuss it because it was kind of a go nowhere piece of legislation at that point. So again, I wish I can say we will keep you updated the more that we know, but right now, they have some getting their act together to do, I guess is the way I would describe it.
Thank you, which leads into several questions we have for Sharon about voter ID. Why is obtaining a picture ID difficult? Why would the last 4 digits of your social security number on an absentee ballot be a bad thing? Why would you say to push back if we already have voter ID laws? Sharon?
Sure, taking them in order. So look, I think at the core of this issue, you have to be willing to accept that every voter in Michigan is not like you. I have a photo ID. I've had one since I was 16, but I also have multiple graduate degrees, and I grew up in a family where there was food on the table and every evening. And my experience, and humbly to everybody on the call, our experience is not everyone's experience. The simple fact is that in the last election, more than 10,000 people did not have in the state of Michigan, registered voters, so already registered voters in the state of Michigan, more than 10,000 did not have their photo ID. Either they don't have one or they didn't have it with them. And they had to sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury. In the previous election in 2016, 18,000 voters. And the analysis of these voters has been done to show that it is more common, the affidavits are more common in precincts that have a very high African-American population. So I think you have to approach this question from the standpoint of, is everybody like me, or do other people have different circumstances? And so, for example, sometimes it could be that someone stole your purse the day before election day and you don't have an ID. Or, my kids that ran in the background threw it in the blender, right? Or I don't have the resources, or I have, issues going on in my life and I haven't been able to go get a current ID, right? And all those things I just described, the blender, the lost purse, I have circumstances in my life, they don't mean that you are not eligible to vote in this state and you don't have a constitutional right to vote. And so putting this barrier in place simply means, if you want to support it, that you are going to disenfranchise some individuals who have a constitutional right to vote. So the second question was about someone's been reading really closely. At one point along the way, there was I'll talk to you in a minute. Somewhere along the way, the legislature has also had a proposal that requires you to put your driver's license number or personal ID number or partial social security number on your application to vote in order to get a ballot. First of all, I would like to say the voters passed no reason absentee voting. They made their voice heard and they didn't think people should have to jump through this hoop. So let's start from that. Whose job, why is it the legislature's job, or who do they think they are, that they should be getting in the way of a voter initiative that gave no reason, the constitutional right to vote by absentee ballot to everyone? But what are some of the concerns that people have? First of all, they have concerns about putting that information, particularly their partial social security number, on this document that's going back and forth. I think other individuals are frustrated, in my opinion, understandably, because you actually do that process. I'm not going to get all into it, but the checking of the number is actually done in Michigan in the course of you registering to vote. So this has actually already been done for anybody who is a registered voter. And I would say finally, sorry, I had to check if someone was over my shoulder. Finally, the more things that you ask a voter to do, the more likely they are going to make an error, a totally benign error. They're going to transfer two numbers. They're going to write not in the most clear. And now guess what? Their quick writing or their transposing of two numbers disenfranchises them. There just is no, I don't see the evidence, particularly with the Senate Republican report coming out this week, that this is needed. And then I think the last question was, why should we oppose this since we already have a law? Well, because we have a law that does two things. It has a very broad list of identification that you can offer, and it has what I describe as a safety valve. So for that individual who had their purse stolen the day before, they don't get disenfranchised. They don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops. They sign, as I said, they sign a legal document swearing that they are the person, that they've put on the name on their application to vote. They affirm, just as you would in a court of law, if you've ever had to sign an affidavit or something like that, their identity. So I think that's sufficient, and the government should not be standing in the way of our citizens making their voice heard.
This is going to be ingrained in us forever. You are muted. We have time for one more question, and this actually goes to both Sharon and Virginia. Can you comment more about the disproportionate impact on people with disabilities of all of these Michigan and national voter suppression laws? These are people who cannot even voice their concerns, yet people want to make it almost impossible for them to vote. Who would like to go first? Sharon?
I can go first. I mean, as I mentioned, the requirement that voters have a signature match when they have already appeared in person in a polling location and provided an ID, and then they have to have a signature match on top of that, I think is a real recipe for voters with disabilities to have a disproportionate number of their ballots challenged. And then they wouldn't be able to vote a normal ballot and they'd have to vote a provisional and come back. I also think, again, going back to the questions about ID, sometimes for voters with disabilities, getting to a Secretary of State's office to get an updated license, that's going to be a greater challenge for some voters than it is going to be for me. Again, I think in a lot of these cases, we have to ask ourselves to think about individuals who perhaps aren't like us, right? And have a different set of circumstances and challenges, or, a life that is different than ours, both opportunities and challenges. And that we want a voting system that works for all of us, not just some of us.
Thank you. Virginia, would you care to comment?
I mean, I would just echo everything that was just said. And I would say that we're working closely with the American Association of People with Disabilities as we review legislation, because one of the things that we realize is that we don't all come with the same lens. And so asking that question of who's missing from the conversation is critically important. And I've learned a lot. And there are also a lot of people who don't consider themselves disabled, so to speak, right? And so you have, in some cases, elderly folks who may have to walk with a walker, or people who can no longer drive. Their driver's license may have expired. They don't, and then they get to go and vote. They have to provide this identification. And then all of a sudden, it's not considered a good piece of identification, or, with signatures changing, somebody's signature, my signature has changed over time. My gosh, I was at 18, I was still trying to do like flary score, making my signature perfect when I first registered to vote. Now it's like a scribble scrabble, right? We all have these things. And so, it's just, again, the idea of people being missing from the table and asking what's relevant and important to them as it relates to what the impact would be to them and their communities. And I would also add, this voter ID provision, which is something across the country that people fight about. Why is it so hard? Why is it so impossible? I will say, even for myself, I got married last fall and my name changed. And I had to go through so many different things just to be able to change my name. And I actually waited to change my name until after the election, because I was afraid that there would be some kind of a mix-up. I wouldn't get my new voter registration card in time. And so it can impact just about anybody. And I was talking to some of the rural voters out in Minnesota not that long ago. And they were sharing how long it takes for them to get to the motor vehicle department, just to be able to get an identification. And sometimes, especially if people are facing troubled times, or maybe don't have the financial ability to go and just have that money set aside, it costs gas. It sometimes takes hours, 2 hours to get to an MVA. Then you have to pay, sometimes take off time from work. And so making it not only as convenient as possible for people, but as accessible for people as possible is really, really important. And so I really think that it's just something that, we need to continue to emphasize around this voter ID provision.
Thank you. We've just about run out of time. I know there are more questions, so I would like to invite all of you that either your question hasn't been answered, or by thinking about this presentation you have more, please address them via email to president@lwvmi.org, and we will direct them to our presenters today. Virginia, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And Sharon, I want to thank you as well. And Sue and Judy, as always, we appreciate your input. So everyone, thank you and have a great day.